Well, good morning and welcome to our American Enterprise Institute event, Following the Money, Ensuring Accountability in Broadband Initiatives. I'm Mark Jamison, a non-resident senior fellow with AEI. In March and November of 2021, Congress passed laws providing about $75 billion to expand broadband in areas that either do not have broadband or have inadequate broadband in Congress's view. The $75 billion is to be spent over the next few years through numerous programs involving the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Utilities Service, or RUS, the U.S. Department of Treasury, state governments, and local governments. Many people have expressed excitement that this money might finally close the digital divide. But we've been down this road before. The programs Congress funded are eerily similar to past federal broadband efforts and that have spent money but had little broadband to show for it. Can we do better this time? What can government officials do this time that will ensure that taxpayers get $75 billion in broadband for their money? What procedures and metrics should politicians and concerned citizens use to provide the oversight? Here to discuss this are four noted scholars and experts in broadband programs. Dr. Michelle Connolly is a professor of the practice of economics at Duke University and has twice served as chief economist for the Federal Communications Commission. Dr. James Prager is professor of public policy at Pepperdine University. He's served at the FCC and conducted rigorous research on broadband programs. Anna Reed is a senior officer for the Broadband Access Initiative at Pew Charitable Trusts. She leads Pew's efforts to examine how states and the federal government can implement these programs wisely. And Dr. Scott Walston is president of the Technology Policy Institute. He was the economic advisor in the Obama National Broadband Plan and has extensively researched broadband programs and currently provides the most comprehensive broadband mapping and analytical tools, at least in my opinion. Michelle, Jim, Anna, Scott, welcome. I have a few questions I'll ask to our panelists. The last few minutes we'll have for the audience to submit its questions, so please follow the instructions on the screen and let us know what your questions are. So Anna, let me begin with you. You're in the trenches for this work more than any of the rest of us. Could you please provide a brief description of what the NTIA, RUS, and Treasury programs and state and local governments involvement, what this is all like and what they're doing?
So thank you so much for the invitation to join the panel this morning. And, this really is a historic moment with the amount of federal funding available to close gaps in broadband access. And as you noted, there are several major programs. I'll start with the USDA Rural Utilities Service, both because, that's kind of a smaller pot of money now at this time, and also it is the program that still goes directly to applicants. There isn't sort of now this intermediary step of state pass through. So USDA RUS provides grants, loan, or they provide several programs to support broadband. The largest being Reconnect. The latest round of Reconnect was $1 billion. The application round closed in November. They also have other smaller programs like Community Connect, which can be focused on sort of more targeted areas, smaller projects, and the distance learning and telemedicine program. USDA funding, is designed to support economic opportunity and opportunity in rural communities. So that's kind of the specific goal of that funding as it pertains to broadband. So the next two pots of funding I'll mention are the two being managed by the Department of Treasury through the American Rescue Plan Act. The State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund has been used by a number of states for broadband, and this is also where we see, local governments applying some of this funding towards broadband expansion efforts. It's a fairly flexible source of funding, given how it was designed to support sort of pandemic-related needs in states and communities. And then the other pot of funding from Treasury is the Capital Projects Fund, which is $10 billion for states and territories, really with a priority on funding broadband infrastructure. States have submitted plans for how they're going to use that money, and a little under half of the states have been approved for that funding. And then finally, the big pot of money that everyone is talking about right now is the broadband equity access and deployment funding, the almost $42.5 billion through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And this funding is primarily for broadband expansion in unserved areas, and notably will be administered by states. So each state will receive a baseline of $100 million, with the remainder to be allocated based on a formula using the recently released FCC maps. So I think just a couple notable things with all of this funding available. First is that most of the broadband funding is now flowing through states. So that is a change in what we've seen with past federal programs related to broadband. I think the next sort of notable thing is these programs have set higher speed standards than we've seen in past federal programs for what the resulting projects must provide. USDA and the Treasury programs are focusing on a standard of 100 megabits per second symmetrical, and the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program is focusing on 120 with a stated preference for fiber infrastructure. And I think the final thing kind of to note as we're looking at these programs and talking about this question of accountability is they are different programs with different priorities, which are working towards a similar goal. And so we're looking at a period of a lot of funding that's going out, some of it going out very quickly, that may not be completely aligned in what those requirements are or what the sort of priorities of that program are as they're working to close these gaps in access.
All right. Thank you, Anna. One question that comes to my mind, I'll ask it later. I'll ask it of you, but everyone else and anyone can chime in on any of the questions. We'll be given the plethora of programs. Does that make it easier for policymakers and for citizens to track and make sure it's all going well, or is that going to make it harder? And kind of what should they do in response to having a lot of different programs? But we'll come back to that. Anyone else want to add anything on just kind of the foundation of programs that we're building on here?
Maybe it is something worth emphasizing is the degree to which this amount of spending is completely unprecedented for broadband. So BTOP, for example, or the funding that came out of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was probably the biggest previous tranche of money. I mean, this is 10 times what that was.
All right, very good. Well, Jim, let me ask the next question of you. So we have seen programs similar to what is being done now with NTIA, Treasury, et cetera. For example, in the stimulus bill, which you just mentioned, this is early in the Obama administration, RUS received $3.5 billion. Well, they received 2.5, but they could spend up to 3.5 for broadband development. Almost all of that money was, frankly, wasted as far as we can tell. The program reached only about 10% of the 7 million people that were supposed to benefit. And some of the 10% actually already had broadband. They were living in urban areas that had good broadband available already. I could go on, but I think that kind of makes the point. You have done some pretty extensive research on the effectiveness of programs like this. Tell us, please, what you've learned through your research and the research you've reviewed.
Sure. Let me just start by saying good morning to everyone. And thank you to Mark and to the American Enterprise Institute for putting together this interesting panel. So last time around, 2009, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, as Mark mentioned, allocated about $7 billion, roughly $5 billion of which went to the program that I'm most familiar with, which is BTOP. And the goal So first of all, what was its goal and what did it get right to the extent that it did? So its goal was to increase broadband access and adoption rates, in particular among populations that were considered underrepresented with respect to broadband usage and access, particularly minorities and low-income households. And so let me just mention, there are three, what I would say are good quality empirical papers that have analyzed this program, in addition to many other less quantitative papers, one of which Janice Hauge from University of North Texas and I worked on together. Let me just start briefly with describing what we found. So first of all, what went well? Well, it did appear that at least the money was spent in counties with high fraction of the target population, so those with low income or minority residents. So that was good. But of course, you don't want to just spend money, you want to get something for the money. And so what we examined was using county level data on fixed broadband access per household, comparing before and after and controlling for trends in broadband access and usage that would have happened anyway. We looked at how does the amount of money that was spent in the county under the BTOP funding per household, whether it was zero or some large amount of money, how did that relate to outcomes that we were interested in, and particularly broadband access by the households. So without getting into econometric details, we did attempt to use methods that were designed to elicit causal effects in program analysis. And the interesting thing that we found is that after controlling for trends, because of course broadband penetration and usage is increasing all the time on average everywhere. After controlling for those trends, we actually did not find any consistent, either in terms of statistical significance or in terms of even the direction of the impact of this funding on broadband usage. In some places, it seemed to be positively associated. In other places, it was negatively associated. In most places, it was just a statistical pile of spaghetti where you couldn't find anything significant at all. One other result that we found was interesting. So the NTIA had estimated that the program was generating new access at about $500 per subscriber, which would be considered an average cost. We found that the marginal cost per subscriber was about almost twice that, $900 per subscriber, quite expensive. Let me just mention briefly two other empirical papers, one of which was published quite recently by Beard, Ford, and Stern. They did something similar in spirit by looking at outcomes of the program in the form of household broadband access. They used a different data source. They used different methods. They actually came to a very similar conclusion. Using high quality econometric methods, they found no discernible impact of the BTOP spending on household access. And then finally, there was a paper published 2 years ago by Chang in Telecom Policy that BTOP also provided funding not just for household broadband access, but also public computing centers, which often meant libraries and other community anchor institutions. And so the question there was, if we spend a bunch of money promoting digital literacy and access through libraries, hopefully that would have spillover effects so that more people could also be able to use broadband at home. So they looked for those positive spillovers, and he did not find anything at all. So I could go on. I'll stop here for now. I'll just note finally, rereading what Janice and I wrote now 7 years ago, I guess, in our paper, we did note that one of our policy conclusions was that even though the legislation called for accountability, the NTIA chose a very limited interpretation of what that accountability meant. So people had to basically report that they spent the money wisely, but they did not require of grantees any sort of true program evaluation of the sort that has been done. So I'll just set that out there for future discussion during this hour.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And I will come back to you on a question, either exactly that or similar like that. You know, if you were talking with a congressional oversight committee, what should that committee be asking of NTIA, Treasury, et cetera, saying, here's what we want, not only so that we can get a story, but other people can evaluate and know that you are doing the right thing, the right things are happening, and that we know we've been effective. And let me just say, I said that you're doing the right thing. That's not you particular, but NTIA, et cetera. As far as I can tell, it's not about personal failings of any particular person. I know the people who were in charge, back in the early part of the Obama administration, sharp, dedicated people. The system just somehow didn't work, and it wasn't about quality of people at all. All right. Well, thanks, Jim. So, anybody else want to chime in on what we learned from some of the past programs? Scott?
Well, I just wanted to add to what Jim said about what they estimated to be the marginal cost per new subscriber, and and look at it from today's perspective. If you just divide the amount of money from BEAD by the number of unserved locations, we're going to that number is many times what Jim said was already a high number. And then if you recognize that not everybody who could subscribe to the new service will, the marginal cost per subscriber is going to be many, many times what Jim said, with the number Jim gave. So we're already starting out with, whether that's an opportunity or a problem is a subjective statement, but it's another example of how much money we're talking about now.
Okay. Michelle or Anna, anything to add to what on this particular topic of what we've learned from the past? So, Michelle, let's go back to current programs to talk about problem areas. I've heard you speak and have spoken with you several times on that topic. This is something you've put a lot of thought into. You've looked into the features that potentially raise the cost of providing broadband, which would mean taxpayers get less for their money than they would. Could you just explain to us what you have found?
Yeah, and actually, to segue from your last question, one of the key things that we should come back to, at least within the new programs, is that while they do mention things like reporting requirements, they're really not clear about what kind of reporting is necessary. And so that's exactly in line with what Jim was saying in terms of the BTOP program. But beyond that, so I looked specifically at the BEAD program and their selection criteria, and there's a lot in there that seems very tangential to the goal of getting broadband or decreasing the digital divide. It's as if the NTIA said, oh, we have this one instrument and we want to slay 20 dragons with it, right? So among the issues within the selection criteria, which fundamentally are going to raise the costs if they're followed explicitly, and if raising the cost, that's in the end going to decrease the efficacy in terms of actually helping to reach those who are unserved or underserved. The main selection criteria issue that I see is the prioritization of fiber above all else. Given that our unserved areas are often rural or mountainous, fiber is not the most efficient, and we have a technology that can reach these households much more cheaply and effectively. So immediately we have a certain loss of or waste of money if the fiber is always put above all else, regardless of cost. The other components are in terms of the selection criteria that are proposed for subgrantees. So they call the states the grantees, and then the states approve subgrants, and they're told to use certain selection criteria for these subgrantees. And within these criteria are things like buy American, use union labor, or have a pre-hire collective bargaining labor agreement, that the subgrantee needs to provide affordability for the middle class, that the subgrantee cannot put data caps, cannot have any unjust or unreasonable network management policies, and that they encourage the states to waive existing laws that restrict or prohibit government and or a cooperative provision of broadband services. All of these criteria are kind of aimed at solving other policy objectives that really have nothing to do with broadband provision, and definitely increase the cost tremendously. And I know that the NTIA just put in, or recently put in, a request to not have the Buy American requirement put on middle mile providers, because they're immediately seeing that this is a real sticking point. The other thing I want to mention within this is that, so for example, so you have Buy American, the union labor. So this is a labor issue, affordability for the middle class. This is kind of a backdoor way of potentially introducing rate regulation that isn't there before. No data caps or unjust reasonable management policies is a way of bringing back issues of net neutrality. And then finally, and this one I do want to talk a little bit more, is in terms of trying to get states to waive existing laws restricting governmental or municipal and cooperative provision of broadband. And the fact that, simply the fact that 18 states do have these laws suggests there might be a reason for that. And conceptually, the reasons are basically anti-competitive concerns. So a clear one is that if a municipality is providing internet service, they are also regulating any other internet service providers in their footprint. So there's a regulatory conflict of interest. Secondly, both municipalities and cooperative internet service providers are insulated from regular market forces, in the sense that they may have access to income from other areas and aren't going to necessarily respond in terms of entering based on market forces, nor exiting based on market forces. And the third thing has to do with the networks, where internet service providers generally have to attach to utility poles that are within the footprint of a municipality or an area. And if the municipality or the cooperative provide electrical or telephone service, they usually own those poles. And they are exempt from federal rate regulation as to how much they can charge to allow a communications provider to attach their poles. So there's an additional strategic component where they can impact an input cost into one of their competitors. So these are the three concerns. So a student of mine, TJ Zuo and I looked at actually what was happening. We looked from June 2015 to December 2020, looked at Form 477 FCC data at the census block level. And before we even did any analysis, I think there were two patterns that we observed that I thought were interesting. We looked specifically at Illinois because this was very data intensive, and the FCC doesn't tell us when a provider is a co-op or a municipality, so you have to do that identification yourself. But we observed two patterns, is that at least in Illinois, munis and co-ops were very, very rarely the first providers. So when we hear the government saying, oh, we want to increase deployment by encouraging municipalities to enter, et cetera, historically, at least in Illinois, that's not the pattern we see. Munis were first providers in their footprints less than 4% of the time. Co-ops were the first providers less than 8% of the time. So they're more oftentimes coming in as a competitor. The other interesting thing is, while co-ops were in rural areas about 75% of the time, munis were in rural areas less than 3% of the time. So 97% of the time, they're not, at least in Illinois, they were not in these rural areas. And so again, suggests that the idea that we should be looking towards munis to help deployment in rural areas, at least that's not the historical pattern that we've seen. So then we want to look at the analysis of the competitive impact of these types of internet service providers, to see if there was reality behind these anti-competitive concerns. So we looked at the probability of new entry each period in a census block by a new ISP, given the state of the market. So we're controlling for basic market factors. We're controlling for the number of firms, the high speeds available in the market. We're controlling for potential entrants by coming from adjacent markets, time-varying measures of market attractiveness like housing density, household income, time fix effects to look at technological progress, and importantly, census block fix effects, so that we get rid of any endogeneity concern as to where a muni or co-op ISP might be located. So anything that we're finding is really based on changes over time within a census block, based on whether a muni or a co-op ISP are present. And what we find is that the presence of a muni or a co-op ISP decreases the likelihood of further ISP entry significantly. And this is not just a question of there being one more competitor. That's in addition to being one more competitor. The fact that that competitor is a muni or an ISP lowers these things. And I can give you, for example, if we just looked at expected probability coming out of these results, if you have two existing incumbent ISPs there, then the average probability of new entry would be about 46%. If one of those two is a co-op, it goes down to about 44%. If one of those two is a muni, it goes down to 32%. And so what we're observing is the co-ops are having a negative impact, but munis are having a really strong negative impact. And a way of seeing this is if we think about two firms and one of them is a muni, they have a slightly lower probability of new entry than a census block with 4 firms. So that one muni is having the same negative impact on further entry than 3 other private firms would have. So it's really showing that a potential entrant into an area sees municipal ISPs and cooperative ISPs as being different from private ISPs and as reducing their expected profits. And that in the end means that it's not really, their entry is not helping competition. So we're observing they're not being the first deployers. Here, we're now seeing they're not really encouraging additional competition. In fact, they're kind of discouraging additional competition. So from both those aspects, the pressure or the suggestion in BEAD and the same thing in ARPA that areas should be encouraging government entry or cooperative entry do appear quite misguided. And then I should also say, in terms of the co-ops, it's a smaller impact. And for co-ops, it's mainly due to pole attachment rates. Illinois is one where the pole attachment rate, there is a premium by the co-ops and munis, but it's pretty small relative to the national. The national premium is about 200%. In Illinois, it was I forgot the number, but it's something like 8 to 10%. So if we were to look at this nationally, we'd probably see even greater dissuasive impacts for cooperatives than we do in Illinois. So that.
All right, thanks for that. That's a lot to try and absorb. But so I understand the bottom line is there are a couple of bottom lines. One is that there are features baked into at least the legislation that people are trying to work around that are going to make broadband more expensive, which means you get less broadband for every dollar that you spend. And then there are particular problems. Maybe municipalities are just amazing broadband providers and nobody thinks they compete with them, or maybe indeed we're in the middle of the World Cup, letting the referee kick the ball maybe isn't quite such a good idea. as well. So there's at least some challenges there that we'd have to deal with. And I'll come back to you, Michelle, on the issue of, okay, if there are concerns over these kind of cost increasing policies, what kinds of metrics, what kinds of information should policymakers, citizens be asking for so they can see, hey, my state broadband's 20% more expensive than over here in this other state, and it's because of these policies. What's up with this? Why aren't we doing better? All right. Anyone else on that topic of what in our current, what we're doing now that might be cost increasing and give us less bang for our buck?
Well,
go ahead.
Sorry. I mean, I think the fact that we don't know what's going on. We don't know what the states are doing. And it's, if anyone says, hey, I have money, do you want it? Everyone, a lot of people are going to say, yeah, give it to me. From what I can tell, some states have already started giving out grants, and we don't even know necessarily to whom they've given them out. We might know to what county they're supposed to go, but I was reading on the North Carolina thing that they had 130 applications. They chose 3, but they didn't say based on what or why or how, and they don't tell us what is in the grant proposal. So if we don't even know those things.
Yeah. Well, let me use that as a segue to bring Scott into our conversation. So, Scott, a lot of your research over the past few years, and you do, your team is amazing work, a lot of different topics, but some of the places where you've been particularly important and other people have done less is in the things that Michelle was just talking about, and that includes what kind of processes should we use to make sure that whoever's receiving the money is the kind of the least cost provider for what's being provided. And then also this issue of affordability and what of our affordability programs, what are the lessons from those as well? Would you mind telling us what you guys have discovered?
Right. Yeah, thanks, Mark. And thanks for having me here. Before I get to that exactly, let me just build on what Michelle was saying and tie it back to a question that you asked earlier, Mark, with these programs that are already giving out money. So there are, like you said, a plethora of programs, and as Anna described, lots of them. This is also, it does make things complicated for the programs going forward, because you're going to want to know, they need to know where these programs have already provided money. So the new FCC map came out, the draft map, and by the way, I think they did an amazing job. They got the map out on time. The data is really clean. It's fun to work with. I mean, we're having a blast with it. And now it's going through the challenge process, and we'll see about the accuracy. But the FCC is going to have to also include all the areas that have already been promised subsidies, but currently show up as unserved. And right now we can do some estimates of that with the RDOF program, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But we don't know anything about the other programs. We don't know their geographic boundaries. We don't know, the extent to which they've been rolled out. I mean, that's the FCC's challenge to work that into the map, but it also makes it hard for states to think properly about where they want to focus, because even though we have this great new draft map, it's still missing a lot. And it's going to be a huge challenge to put the forward. Now, let me go to what you're saying, which is basically, how do we get the biggest bang for the buck, for our buck here? And we have a lot of history with giving out subsidies for broadband. And a lot of the current discussion takes place as if almost that hasn't happened. But we've been doing this since at least 1996. Of course, we didn't call it broadband, but we've been subsidizing rural telecommunications through the Universal Service Fund, between $5, $6, $7 billion a year since then. And we've learned an awful lot, mostly about what doesn't work. The way it used to be done, and I'm going to be sort of oversimplifying here, is that a company would say, all right, we're providing service here. It's going to cost us X dollars, so give us X dollars. And then the Universal Service Fund would turn around and say, okay, here it is. But then there are also cost models to try to estimate how much something is supposed to cost in those areas. And then these would generally rely on, the subsidies would generally rely on cost models. But cost models aren't very good. They turn out to very often be wrong because there's so many inputs into it. And each of those inputs is usually measured with error. And you add all that error together, and the estimates, of course, have a huge error bound, but they're presented as precise. And that is just not true. And the second problem is that the information that feeds into them often comes from the companies that are receiving subsidies. And that's not nefarious. I mean, they're the ones doing the operations. They do know that. But it creates an incentive to always have cost models that show very high costs. And so they're a great starting point for estimates, and so they can be important. But they turn out to really not be the best way, the most effective way to give out subsidies. So what do you do instead of that? If we believe that there are places that are not economic to serve, but we believe sort of as a social contract, we want some minimum level of service, and that level changes over time. So we want some way to discover what is the actual cost of providing that service. And it turns out that the best way is what we're calling reverse auctions. And that phrase kind of turns people off, but basically it's competitive bidding. Governments do this for everything. They want to buy reams of paper. They say, all right, who can give it to us for the least money? And that's basically what happens here. And this is not a new idea. It was started actually in developing countries. Like Peru had the first one. And it showed that when you have companies competing with each other for their opportunity to serve the areas. And so this says it's essentially who can provide the service for the least amount of money. You end up being able to serve far more areas than you would have otherwise, because the cost per location, or however you want to normalize it, ends up being much, much lower, because companies reveal how much they actually believe it's going to cost. Now, they don't always work, of course. The details of these auctions matter a lot, and they can fail. But sort of overall, they have been very successful. But recently, they have gone completely out of fashion for universal service. Congress doesn't mention it. There's pressure not to mention it. And the reason is because what people perceive as the failure of the Rural Digital Opportunities Fund, RDOF, where it was a reverse auction to provide service. And because there were so many problems, people viewed so many problems with that, opponents of reverse auctions were able to take that and turn it into sort of overall opposition. The problem, though, is that the failures with RDOF had nothing to do with the auction design of it. The auction worked very well. The people at the FCC who run auctions know what they're doing. They're the best ones in the world at this. Not that they can't make mistakes, but they're good. The problem was the eligibility requirements. So the biggest company was a wireless firm the biggest winner was a wireless firm that almost nobody had heard of, and it wasn't clear still not clear that they'd be able to provide the service that they promised they'd be able to provide. And then the FCC sort of eliminated Starlink, SpaceX Starlink, even though well after they had won lots of subsidies. They didn't really provide any good reasoning for it. They just basically changed their mind and said, no, I'm sorry, you can't win. You can't have this money. So all of those controversies has made people think that we shouldn't do reverse auctions. And companies that currently receive subsidies don't like them because they're afraid that they'll get less. And so this was a good opportunity for them to tear down the process. But this is the best way to get the biggest bang for the buck. If you want to provide the most broadband service, then you need to provide it for the least amount of money per area. And not having some kind of competitive market that allows firms, induces firms to reveal what they think the cost is of providing service, you're going to spend a lot more. It's another one of those things that Michelle listed all of these bugs or features of the programs that will raise costs. And people might think any one of those or all of those are great things to do, but each one of them adds cost to the program. And so the question is, do you want to add that cost? Is it worth it? And it's the same here. why would you use another method when you know that this one will be so much more effective? Now, we did, a colleague of mine, Sarah O, senior fellow at TPI, did some work looking at BTOP and the selection mechanism that it used. It did not use a reverse auction, even though many of us had advocated for it. There was an economist letter we wrote. It was called, a letter by 71 concerned economists, but of course it became 71 disappointed economists because they didn't do that, and instead they used really what has come to be called in spectrum auctions in spectrum a beauty contest. Companies or any entities, any eligible entities submitted their proposals for what they wanted, and then there were groups of people who just looked at them, and there weren't consistent measures for how to do it. So there was no consistent comparison across projects, and it was, in reality, it was just a mess. And so what Sarah found, she did a simulation and several, lots of Monte Carlo simulations, and found that we could have served twice as many houses, residences with the same amount of money if they'd given it to the most cost-effective programs first, working their way down to the least. And that what they actually did was almost no better than just random selection. Throw the projects down the stairs and pick up the ones at the bottom and say these are funded. That's about what the effectiveness of what they did. And we want to make sure that doesn't happen again. Now, part of doing a reverse auction, of course, is deciding what it is you want to measure, what it is they're bidding on, and that goes to the point. I think Michelle and Jim both made this, that you need to know what it is you want to measure. What is it you're going for, and then not just have those metrics. Think about how you're going to measure them. Think about how you're going to track them. And think about that as you begin the process. Don't just look back and retrospectively and say, let's take a look at how we did, but build it in. Build in ways to evaluate the programs. And so far we see very, very little talk of any of that. Now, we also know that there's huge amounts of money for just running these programs, which is another way to compare it to the BTOP program. Just the amount of money available here for administrative expenses is just about the same size as the entire BTOP program, which is sort of another kind of interesting comparison. But money is there for evaluation if they want to do it. And you could even do it in ways, in creative ways. We don't need, a glossy report by a consulting firm that's just telling them what they want to hear. Give money to local universities. A small amount of money you could get graduate students all over the place doing different evaluations of these programs. We would learn so much and for so little money compared to what we're spending. And I would love to see that. Now, related to evaluation, we've talked a little bit about middle mile. Middle mile is relatively small in the current amounts, but there's talk of spending more, like $20 to $30 billion on it. And one of the things I worry about with middle mile is that it's very hard to define. It's very hard to know whether it's being effective, whether your subsidies were effective. So any part of these programs should include ways of defining it and measuring it. One of the things we found when we do various papers on BTOP, and we say that the number of residences connected, households connected, increases in adoption, so on, wasn't effective. People say, "Oh, well, you're missing the point of BTOP. A lot of it was for middle mile." And so you can't use that measure. So, okay, well, what measure can we use? Well, oh, that's not our problem. And so, don't let that be a way to escape evaluation. So I guess I'll just leave it there.
Well, let me go back to something you were saying before. You talked about the difficulty of in the RDOF auction of having companies that people hadn't heard of before. The legislation, as I understand it, the infrastructure legislation specifically favors startups, companies that have not been involved in this before. So if that shows up as a feature in a state's programs, what is it that a state or its citizens or the policymakers there or someplace else could do to make sure that goes better than what we've seen elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because it also kind of goes to the technology point. Michelle said that they favored fiber when we would like these to all be technology neutral. Just define whatever the requirements you want, speed, latency, and so on, and then let anybody bid who can provide that. And part of being technology neutral is that we want to increase competition for these grants, and part of increasing competition is allowing new companies to participate, but they may not have much of a track record, and we don't want to end up with the same problem, the same kind of problems that RDOF had. So it's a difficult problem because these sort of seem like competing objectives. You want as much competition for these grants as possible, but you also want to make sure that a winner is capable of doing what they promise. So, but there are ways to deal with this. And so, for example, Greg Roston and I wrote a paper or a submission. We submitted this to the FCC. Ways to think about how to transfer the risk. So, you can have various eligibility criteria, make sure they have money and so on. But you can do things like say that they don't get any funds until something is already built. They've proven that they can do it. And with that, if a company believes that what it can do, believes that it can do what it says it will do, then it should have no trouble raising money. Even a very small company, if it knows it's promised a check from the government as soon as something's rolled out, it will be able to borrow the money. It won't have problems doing that. But then the company is taking the risk, not the government at first. And that's especially appealing when you think about something like Starlink, because why should we be in the business of giving Elon Musk money or just giving him an option on something? But we sure do want Starlink to be part of our system. It has the potential to be so good, but put the risk on that. And so that's one way of kind of dealing with this tension. But you're right, it's a tension.
All right. Just to elaborate on something else you had said, you talked about how sometimes it's really hard to ensure that when the funding is provided, that it's actually a good competitive process. One of I've been involved in a few review committees of grant processes governments have done before. And in my experience, kind of what happens, this is something we want to try and avoid here, is that once the technical analysts, people like me, have done our work, then the phones start ringing. And it's Congressman so-and-so or Congressman staff so-and-so saying, hey, Joe's Broadband's a fine company. Why are you giving them such a hard time? And that sways a lot of decisions. And so it'd be nice to have some ways of counteracting that as well. Let me go back to you. Or does anyone else want to chime in on what we just talked about? Jim?
Yes, actually, just Mark, to follow up on your point. So Janice Hauge wrote a paper examining exactly that point for BTOP and so the title of the paper says it all: Political Influence Within the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, Evidence from BTOP. Let me just read one of her conclusions. Significant political influence over funding occurred, with programs more likely to be funded if submitted under a Democratic governor, from a state with a Democrat voting majority, or from a county with representation on a key congressional committee. So that speaks for itself.
If I were the elected official, I'd be saying, but I know exactly what my constituents need. Well, why do I need all this other stuff? And it gets really hard. And part of what I do in my day job at the University of Florida is helping countries deal with pressures as they try to implement policies. So, all right, good point. Thank you so much.
Could I add one thing? So one of the advantages when you have a reverse auction is you very clearly state this area is what you're bidding on serving, and we require this speed and this and that. I have a suspicion that a lot of states are just going to say, send us your proposals, right? And if they're doing these beauty contests, then you're going to have things where some proposals are overlapping with others, And then you could very easily end up with the unserved areas never having anyone proposing coverage of that. So even though I don't think any of the states are going to do official reverse auctions, doing competitive bidding is bringing you in that direction by making it clear what you want done and to what standard, so that there's far less wastage in terms of the plans, and making sure that the things that you really want to get accomplished hopefully do get accomplished.
And let me add one more thing to that
Sure.
also. That it's like Michelle said, it may not be, well, you didn't exactly say this, but it may not be realistic to think that every state is going to be able to build a reverse auction. So it would be good, it'd be great to find ways that states can work together, that NTIA, more specifically the FCC, could help states. It's unfortunate that the FCC was taken out of this whole equation, except for the map. And that's not to criticize NTIA. It's just that's not what they do, and they've had to build up a whole operation to do it. And in terms of just getting lots of proposals, I'm also afraid that that's already what's happening. Treasury, sends out these press releases that said it made an award to such and such a place. Why? What other applications did it get? What were the criteria for doing it? And that's $10 billion. Also, another place that's weird. Why is it at Treasury? And what's the oversight? It's not like Janet Yellen has better things to do than to worry about this $10 billion. So what's the whole process over there?
Can I jump in and ask a question?
Sure.
So with the BEAD funding, it incentivizes, it's a matching grant program, and it incentivizes using the least commitment of federal funding for a given award possible. And when we've looked at state programs, a number of states have used those matching grant programs. Granted, the amount of funding coming through state programs is significantly that states have funded their programs with is significantly smaller than what any state will see with the federal funding. But many of those states are funding projects that come in with a much lower match than the required match percentage, right? Like the provider you have a 50-50 grant, they're funding 80% of the project. And not every state again, but many states do have very clear, transparent, grant scoring processes that incentivize, the greatest jump in level of service for the lowest cost. And so I guess, could you talk a little bit more about how a competitive grant program, your perspective on whether that achieves some of that same goal of lowering the cost, or sort of resulting in the lowest commitment of public funding possible for a project?
Sure. Scott, do you want to address that? Because the basic challenge, I don't want to talk too much economies here, but is that the more you're comparing apples and oranges, the more information asymmetry problems you have. And that just drives up the resulting price that you end up with. But as a practical matter, what do you do?
Yeah, well, like Michelle said, one of the things that it does is it forces you to decide how you're very, very specifically, not just the areas that you're talking about, but how you're going to evaluate, and also what you care about the most. And the idea is then also to create some kind of mechanism that helps reveal what the true cost of providing service in an area is. And people think of market mechanisms as a way to find mechanisms to make people pay for something, but it could be the reverse. I mean, basically, it's a price discovery mechanism or a cost discovery mechanism, and that's the point here. When the I think it was the first reverse auction the FCC ran was for the first mobility fund phase 1 service, and it was a relatively small amount of money, in hundreds of millions of dollars, I think. But I wrote a paper on it, and it served far more areas than it would have been able to, and it did. It kept costs down, and it was able to stretch the amount of money it had far farther. Now, the cost of providing an area is what it is, and we try to figure it out. So how that ends up, how the amount of money that a company gets ends up affecting the prices people pay is a more complicated question. And if companies get too much, it's just extra profits. And of course, there is a risk of buyer's remorse too, winner's curse. Somebody might bid too little and then be sorry they did it.
All right. Thanks. Thank you all for that discussion on that. So, Anna, let me go back to you if I could, please. So in addition to this issue of how do you know who's going to do the best job for the money, which we've spent some time on, another key topic that has come up is how do we hold the funding recipients accountable for delivering on their promises? Over the years, I've been involved in lots of things around the world, and we have this concept of what's called accountability-based aid, which is once the project is delivered, it's doing what it's supposed to, then the money flows. That's one way of maybe holding people accountable. There are probably others as well. So what are you seeing for the state, the locals, the federal officials that are running these programs? What kind of accountability mechanisms are they including? And what would you like to see them include?
So I think, we're kind of a complicated moment in that there are so many layers to these grant programs, right? So the state will be playing a role in holding the recipients of the funds accountable for that. And then there's some level of accountability of the state to the federal funding agencies. And so it creates a more complex picture than, in a direct state, federal to provider, state to provider, or federal to state without that next layer funding process. As we look at kind of the accountability measures that are laid out, some of which were touched on a little bit earlier in the BEAD program in particular, there's, something of a challenge, and this will be as it kind of flows down to states as well, and striking a balance between being prescriptive enough that, we are ensuring that the funding is being spent as intended, that it is going to solve problems of access in those areas that lack it, while also not being so prescriptive that there's no flexibility in how that funding is used, because the challenge can look different in different places based on a whole host of factors. And with that, there's also the issue of potentially making the funds overly burdensome to access, which can then result in, fewer projects getting funded or fewer applications for areas that are available for funding. And then I think, as we look at these programs, there are a couple things that are highlighted sort of throughout them. And with the BEAD program, one thing I did want to touch on is the public input process. So there's this lengthy 5-year planning process that requires a significant, and it's supposed to be transparent and documented engagement process of a range of stakeholders in the state. And then that plan will be the basis of, for the application by the eligible entity of the state for the use of those funds. And that provides a point of, accountability to the public who has engaged in putting together, and other stakeholders in the state who've engaged in putting together those plans or informing those plans. Then I wanted to highlight specifically, Scott brought up the challenge with the FCC maps of having to put all those other funding commitments on, but the programs, both the Treasury and the NTIA programs do not allow funding to be applied to areas with existing enforceable state or federal funding commitments. So where states have already made a grant, where there are other federal funding sources, including RDOF, those funds may be used to potentially complement, to extend those areas, but not for the same area that has already been funded. And then in terms of both the Treasury and NTIA funds, there's a multi-step application process for states, which required an application and a plan of how the funding will be used, which is what we're seeing Treasury begin to approve now. And then the states are, granting out those funds. Treasury also requires that those plans include that the project and program outcomes will be measured through an evaluation plan. I don't know that we've seen any of those evaluation plans at this point, but there is a requirement that be included in the grant plan. And then, the selection criteria were touched on briefly, that states will provide as a part of their, their initiative, their requirements for the BEAD funding. And those plans must be approved by NTIA. And I think it's worth noting that, a number of states have had active grant programs. Some of those programs have had, again, fairly transparent selection criteria and, sort of monitoring criteria as well throughout the grant process. And so that is, I think, just kind of another notable aspect. And then middle mile projects came up. So I would note that the Treasury funding does also strongly recommend that there be a last mile partner in place for any middle mile projects that are funded. And that's something we're seeing more in some of these grant requirements, as well as that it's, less of this kind of build it and they will come, and more of a, we have a partner in place before we make this funding commitment. So those, and I also, of course, want to mention the challenge process, which is an important component. This is something we've seen in state programs as well. So when there are applications for funding, there's an opportunity for providers that have existing plans or funding commitments to challenge those applications. In the case of these programs, there will also be, opportunities for local governments or residents to challenge whether or not their location is served.
All right, thank you. Michelle?
Could I ask Anna a question, because you seem to know more than I do about this? But so how is this? So the monies some of them have already gone to the states, and some have already been at least awarded to. And I can't find out any information about that. So how would I if I were I can see where I can put in a request, but I can't see who else put in a request. So how do we do? So I'm wondering, how do we do challenge process if all this is being done immediately and nothing's being posted? And even in terms of, community involvement, I don't see where at what stage that's happening if there's no information being put out.
So I think it gets a little bit complicated because there are the two separate programs. So just starting with the BEAD program, the only funding that started to go out there is the planning fund. So states have started, I think the majority of them have been now approved for their planning funds, and that's the process there where there will be that engagement. The infrastructure funds for that will not be released until after the FCC formula allocation, which is expected to be in June. The Treasury funds have been, being approved. And I think there's kind of a complication in that you have, again, those state and local fiscal recovery funds, which are ones that we have seen a number of states allocate and kind of generally through their existing grant programs, or sometimes some kind of emergency grant program that, they were able to, if their state grant program requirements were kind of at odds with the Treasury requirements. And then with the Capital Projects Fund, many of those are also going through existing state grant programs. So then that level of engagement, that level of looking at the application is at the state program level. And most of those state programs have pretty well established challenge processes. So the applications are posted for a period of time. Other, interested parties have an opportunity to respond to challenge grant applications. And then there's generally a review process. And what that looks like differs a little bit from state to state. And so that's kind of how we're seeing that funding start to roll out right now at the generally, through, again, existing state level programs.
Thank you.
Scott?
Well, actually, just wanted to quickly add, one thing I think we've all touched on, I'm not sure we said explicitly, is the importance of transparency in all of these programs. And I think right now we're beginning to see very strong lack of transparency across the board. We don't know what's been submitted to Treasury. States have submitted draft plans to NTIA, I believe. We can't see those. CostQuest doesn't let people see the fabric, only ISPs and governments. And now they're adding more. Apparently, they're going to be charging for more things that should just be publicly available. Every application should be public, and the reasons for choosing them should be public. And usually claims of things needing to be proprietary don't stand up to scrutiny, and I feel we're heading down a very opaque path.
All right, and thank you for that. As I mentioned earlier, a part of my day job is doing coursework for utility regulators, including in tech, around the world. And when I talk with them about transparency, I explain that this is part of regulating the regulator. We let people look over our shoulders and watch the work that we do. Back when I was a regulator in the US, and where I was, it was fairly extreme. Anybody could any citizen could walk in my office at any time and go through everything I was doing. That was just one of the parts of the deals, which I always thought was strange that right existed. But as I got out of that space and started working around the world in it, now I see why. It really is critical that people be able to watch us, if nothing else, just to be able to build trust. So I'm going to turn to the audience in just a few minutes for questions that they have. Let me just go around with each of you and ask you, kind of what would be your call to action for officials who are implementing programs, for the policymakers, the public who's overseeing them? People are going to be studying these. What's the call to action of something someone could do that would help us be more successful than the paths we're currently on? And let me kind of go. Let me start with you, Jim, on that. And I'll just go around my screen. Nobody can see my screen, so you don't know what order you're going to be asked. But I'll start with Jim.
Excellent question. And asking a bunch of academics that question is not our comparative advantage, but I'll give it my best shot. So one thing I would say is there is a tendency, when thinking about accountability for these programs, to focus on a typical government mindset of preventing waste, fraud, and abuse, which is really important, but that is only a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the success of a program. So yes, make sure that people are doing what they say that they're doing, but also go beyond that to do actual rigorous quantitative analyses. Just let me toss out an idea here. Just to kick off discussion or some thoughts perhaps in people's minds. One of the things that you could do is, if you're not going to auction down on this metric, you could at least require reporting the metric of both average and marginal cost per location served, or per location where broadband has been made available, even if service is not taken. If that information is public, then after the fact or even during the process, then the public, ultimately the taxpayer, and even more ultimately the voter, gets to decide, was it worth spending $6,000 per head to bring broadband to, for example, a Native American reservation area? And the voter can decide. We have many social competing priorities, and I think the more specific information that is out there, the more accountability there can be.
All right, thank you. Michelle, you're next on my screen. What's your call to action?
Well, just based on our discussion, I would love it if the states or whomever is doing these grants make public their selection criteria to begin with. Secondly, just make the applications public so that anyone can look at them and check what's going on. Requires very specific outcomes or measures in the reporting of grantees in terms of households passed, what technology they're using, where they're located, things of that nature, and make the outcomes of the reporting of these metrics public. So that goes along with kind of what Jim was saying in terms of average cost or marginal cost. But I'm thinking even simple things of, if we can just see how many households they've actually passed or where they actually are and what technology they're doing and who's doing it, then others can use that information to do some analysis that would be useful. But with them not even, with states not even stating what their criteria are that they've chosen, there's no opportunity for anyone to come in and say, well, are you sure you want to do that versus something else?
All right, thank you. So Anna, I'll go with you next. A little unfair because you're actually talking with these folks. So I'm not going to ask you to divulge what you're saying, but for us today anyway, what would be your call to action?
I think I kind of have a three-part answer here.
Sure.
So I think the first is, for state and local officials not to think about these funding streams in isolation, right? Like what are how do they work together to, achieve the goal of, reaching all the remaining unserved locations in your state. I think the next piece is to, think of this accountability question as one that's ongoing, right? Like it's not even, it's not when we see the funding go out, it's not when, even a network comes online. And we have seen some state programs begin to have sort of a longer tail on their reporting from providers, where they require them to ensure that they're providing the level of service committed to in their grant application for a period of time after, the funding, after the end of the funding, once that network's come online. And then I think the final piece is, for anyone out there to engage in, the state planning processes that states are beginning to undertake through BEAD, as well as, if there's the individual consumer challenge on the FCC maps as well. So there's an opportunity there to look at and challenge the location and service data. And so, engaging in and participating in these processes.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Scott, you'll get the last word on this question.
Yeah, evaluation and transparency. There's such a strong tendency to want to keep things secret and private, and that's just bad policy. I mean, we're not talking nuclear launch codes here. These are applications and processes that should all be public. And I don't mean things like, internal meetings. People should be allowed to, safely bat around crazy ideas without worry of being criticized. But application criteria, applications, decision processes, all of that should be public. And if a policymaker thinks that something should be proprietary, just really think about, why are you doing that? What bad thing would happen if it were public? And if the bad thing is that somebody might realize that you're making a mistake with your decision, well, that's all the more reason to make it public, or maybe not do the thing. So that's what I would say.
All right, very good. Well, let me turn to our audience now. We have a couple of questions. And the first one is about precision agriculture. I don't know how many of you have ever thought about this or worked on the issue, but let me read the question, and then I'll just take a volunteer to try and answer it. The question is, what is to be done in support of precision agriculture in this era of unprecedented federal funding programs for broadband, especially considering that those areas do not even register as serviceable locations in the FCC's fabric? It is also important to mention that it has been proven that precision agriculture efforts result in double-digit improvements in production yield. First, what is precision agriculture, and what is being done in that area with any of these programs, to the best of your knowledge?
I don't know anything about this, about precision agriculture, which makes it easier to have an opinion. Uninformed opinions are the best, right? But just generally speaking, though, this program is, it's residential and business, and it does ignore things like this. You want connectivity, but a different kind of connectivity. Reliable, but probably not bandwidth intensive. This is machine to machine things where they're you don't need your tractor to watch Netflix, but you need it to constantly be in contact. And you're right, it's not part of this program. It's a different kind of connectivity. I don't know exactly how to think about it, but the questioner is correct that or implicitly correct that it's not considered in this program. It's not part of it. Maybe it should be.
Yeah, a lot of this precision ag stuff has to do with the Internet of Things, sensors, just bringing a lot more technology, particularly wireless 5G type technology, pushing that out to the edge. And ag is just one example of, one of the numerous examples of where the Internet of Things will make the world a very different place 10, 20 years from now than it is today. One thing I would say is, in addition to the fact that, yeah, these programs are not really designed to address this at all. Maybe that's a missed opportunity. Maybe it's not. There is the question of who should undertake this investment, right? So the more you talk about benefits to a particular patch of ground owned by a particular farmer, or more likely nowadays an agribusiness, then the question is, are there really is this an externality problem of not having access to this, or is this just private investment that could be at least partially undertaken by the company itself? So I'll leave it at that.
All right. So my father is a farmer in Kansas. So I actually talk about this a little bit, and what you have been saying is exactly right. It's largely a wireless issue, so it's they actually manage equipment out in fields using satellites. They actually do monitor what's going on in different buildings and such with technology. So it's satellites and 5G, really not part of the BEAD program, and not much part of any others as well. So maybe that is indeed a missed opportunity. But you're exactly right, though, that this matches right over to what's going on in manufacturing and other areas where people are customizing 5G networks to be able to manage what's going on in their factories. All right, very good, thank you. So let me go to the, I've got one other guest audience question. It says, in the panelists' opinion, so I guess this is open to anyone, which specific states could serve as useful models for wise and transparent spending vis-a-vis broadband funding? So who have you seen that, at least for what we know today, could be someone to look to if you're another state?
I would note that we have a lot of resources on state programs on our on the Pew website, which look at different aspects of how states with prior to the federal funding were working to advance broadband goals. And there are a couple states that I think are highlighted a lot that do stand out. That if you go to their websites, you can find a lot of information about what they funded, how they funded it, what has changed between grant rounds. Colorado is always one that's kind of up there. Minnesota is another. Virginia has a fairly transparent process, though, and their program also has a number of sort of other priorities that are incorporated into it as well. So there are some really good state examples of states that have been doing this and do make the information about, are very transparent with the providers applying to their programs, provide a lot of resources for them up front, and then also have fairly transparent selection criteria and, good reporting on what's been funded.
Any others? All right. So I don't see anything else from the audience. Oh, wait. Yes, we do. We have one other. Okay. So I don't see this directed to any particular person, so I'll take volunteers. If one looks at cost of ownership over useful life, optical fiber networks are one of the most inexpensive deployments possible. Do the panelists agree that the time horizon used to evaluate economic efficiency is critical to that process? For example, fixed wireless has a significant shorter obsolescence curve than optical fiber because of the limited spectral efficiency of radio frequency transmission. Don't have to be an engineer to interpret this. It's just a matter of the fiber longer than radio equipment, and so over lifetime, perhaps it is more efficient. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, I've got thoughts on this.
Okay, very good,
So,
Scott.
so first of all, yes, we should absolutely take time into account. And if you want to take time into account on the back end, you ought to take it into account on the front end. And so, what's the fastest way to get broadband connectivity? It's usually not building out fiber. So, do you value speed of availability or how long it's going to last? And if you discount the future at all, then how long it's going to last ends up being less important than whether being able to get broadband tomorrow. So yeah, so let's take it into account. We do take the time into account in every single regulatory analysis in the government, and I think it's wrong that we don't take it into account here. That doesn't mean wireless will always win, of course, because it does have issues, well, like the person who asked the question said. But the other thing about fiber is that fiber has somehow now there's this myth that fiber lasts forever. And that it's always going to be least expensive. Just Google fiber life, optical fiber life. It needs replacement after 25 years. The CEO of Digital Bridge said this at our at the TPI Aspen conference last summer, and they provide, they build some of these things. All networks need to be upgraded all the time, and fiber isn't different. You can carry more information and you can probably scale it easier quickly, but they all need upgrades. And what you really want to do is compare the total cost of service over time, the net benefits, and that also means what people will do with it, how much people value it. And for that, it's not clear that fiber wins. You want to define your minimum, like I said, the minimum speeds, latency, jitter, anything else you want to define, and see who can provide the best one. And if you want to include time, I absolutely think you should. But I think fiber would be unhappy if we did.
All right, very good. Another question.
Well, actually, let me just follow up with that, because that was a big rant against fiber. But for most applications, I should say fiber is great. Of course we want it in high density areas and where it makes sense. So I didn't mean that to be an anti-fiber screed. It's just not always the most appropriate thing.
Yeah, Scott, and your point about discounting future benefits is an excellent one. Anyone in the business world would do this. We absolutely need to do this in the world of public policy and government as well. So just briefly, if we're talking about the purported benefits of having fiber in the ground because it'll still be used and useful 25 years from now. Well, just to throw out a number, at a 10% interest rate, the present value of $1's benefit to society 25 years from now is 9 cents. I just did the calculation. So these arguments don't have as much force as perhaps they might seem to people not familiar with the notion of the time value of money and benefits.
All right. And so one of the takeaways is it's really hard to have a national policy on a technology because it always just depends upon the context. All right. So another question from the audience. What are your thoughts? And again, they didn't pick out anyone in particular, so this is open to anyone, on having a national report card that would grade all the states on how well they spend the money and how much broadband they end up providing. What are your thoughts? No thoughts. Scott, you can weigh in. I'll weigh in if you don't.
In principle, I think it's a great idea. It'll force us to think about what it is we really want to do with the money. I would have to take into account things, different challenges across states. That naturally costs will be different in some states than in others. So we want to do the best we can to make sure that the comparisons are fair. But in principle, I think it's a great idea.
Okay.
I would add again that with the BEAD program, states will be putting together these plans. And so something that measures state progress against those plans that they've submitted to NTIA for how they're going to spend the money could be really useful for both, informing people about progress in their states and some comparison between states.
Okay, I would, that's kind of what academics do, although we just don't warn people in advance. We're going to measure them. So letting people know, here are the metrics with all the consumer warnings here that you manage what you measure. So if we say we're going to measure the wrong things and people feel the pressure of those measurements, they'll go off and do the wrong things. So we have to be pretty good in announcing what we'll be looking at. All right, so let me ask one more question. And it's not a sum up question. It's something I talked about earlier, but we've never quite spent much time on. And that is this issue of affordability. We see things in the legislation about we need to make sure that things are affordable for the middle class. There are programs being funded right now at the FCC through the legislation about giving low-income households discounts on broadband. We've been at this for a long time and giving discounts on first telecommunication service, broadband services. What have we learned? And Scott, I'm going to start with you, but anyone else can chime in because I know you've done research in the area.
Right. So, we have done this through things like this through the Lifeline program, which gives a much smaller amount of money than the emergency broadband benefit, which became the affordable connectivity program, did. And even though it was not particularly cost effective, it did seem to have an effect, which is different from the rural subsidies. And the thing that's nice about the ACP is that it's the closest thing we've come to having like a voucher program that we've had before.
ACP, what is it?
The ACP, the Affordable Connectivity Program. I think that's what it stands for, right? Which gives a subsidy, monthly subsidy to households that qualify, and also I believe a one-time equipment, a small amount of money for equipment too. And it's not a permanent thing like the Universal Service Program, the Universal Service Fund. It will run out. It's a set amount of money. It will run out depending on how many people sign up for it. They estimate 2024. So it's nice that it's this voucher-like program. I think we want to make sure we think about what it's for. Is it just to make life easier for low-income people? So we want it to help people who already subscribe, or do we want it to encourage adoption? Because those are kind of two different things. And we want to think about which it's for, and then how we think about it affects how we then evaluate it.
All right, very good. Other thoughts on that?
I think we just like to highlight, that there are kind of two conversations around affordability. There's how to make broadband affordable for, the middle class family, like what that looks like, what policy solutions can be used to do that. And then there's connecting low income households. And these are things we look at as somewhat separate but often I think we have kind of, we lump them together. They get lumped together in conversations about affordability, but they require different policy solutions.
So Anna, is it the case then when people are talking about affordability for middle income households, they're not worried about people not buying broadband? Presumably, if it's not a subscription issue, they're going to buy it. It's just freeing up some money for them. Is that the thinking on affordability? That's exactly how we used telephone service, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, the sort of where it fits into a household budget, and then the sort of concern about what the cost of service is, maybe across markets in the U.S. or you see concern about it with international comparisons frequently as well. So and I know Scott, you probably have a lot to add on this particular subject, but what is affordable for a middle class family if they're looking at how this fits into their household budget and what can be done to ensure that service is not out of reach of middle income Americans.
I find the conversation about the affordability for the middle class sort of weird, because first of all, how do we define the middle class? How do we define affordable? According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, broadband service, internet service is one of the few things whose price is not increased by much, if anything, in real terms. We want to worry about, we want to be concerned with competition, of course, but it's hard to know exactly what this means. I don't want to get into whataboutism, but I wish we, focused more on that for healthcare, for example. It's just strange that this has become a focus for broadband.
Okay. Michelle, do you have something to add?
So I think there's also a lot of evidence that people, the willingness to pay is there, and that demand for these services are pretty inelastic, not changing that much as prices change. So when people are saying, oh, well, we want to make sure a middle-class family fits in their budget, well, are we going to have a program for everything that they're actually already willing to pay for, but just as part of their budget? Like, at what point are we subsidizing just to make people happy, or is it?
I think that's a little bit the distinction we're trying to make, right? Like, so the subsidy programs are something that should be focused on connecting low-income households, right? And so then there can be a discussion about what middle-class affordability is, but it isn't necessarily something that's tied to a subsidy program.
Right. Yeah, so that's a separate issue. But I mean, also a lot of ISP providers provide lower tier, low income service. And what has been interesting, like during COVID, some were offering free service at a certain tier, and people would come and be offered free service and decide to pay more to get a higher tier service, which is evidence that there is a willingness to pay. And if people have a willingness to pay in the sense that they value this, that it provides them that utility, then it's not clear to me how much we need to be doing. I agree. Or also generally, I mean, if the issue is poverty, maybe we need to worry about poverty.
Right. I mean,
and you'll get the last.
So, I mean, as a microeconomist who teaches on efficiency in my core public policy class, I'm not a fan of specific egalitarianism. I mean, these sorts of programs, do we need a low-income program for broadband, for electricity, for this, for that? If the purpose of these programs is just, well, we can do it through this program because we have the money, I mean, okay, great, there's political constraints. This is not the most efficient way to make room in household budgets for other things, right? I mean, unrestricted cash grants are going to be more efficient. Also less paternalistic. I mean, this is an AEI event. Let's point out the liberty aspect here. Saying that you should spend this money on broadband is a paternalistic approach. It's probably not popular for me to say that with pro-broadband advocates, but let's let the household decide. If they have an extra $10 in their budget per month, should it go to buying something else for their children? Should it go towards healthcare? Should it go towards education? Let's think about letting people make responsible choices of their own.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. We have run over time. There's just a lot more to say as well, but we have to cut it off for our commitments and time. So thank you, Michelle, Jim, Anna, and Scott for your insights. They've been excellent. The battle to modernize broadband and to protect taxpayers, it never ends. In fact, one thing we didn't get to talk about was how do we keep the momentum on paying attention? Because that's been one of our problems in the past, is once the money's spent, people move on to something else. So I'd like to thank everyone for being with us today. Please watch further events from the American Enterprise Institute. Share your thoughts. Let what else you would like to see our scholars address. So thank you all very much and have a good rest of your day.